What happens when your most loyal, most experienced, and most valuable people begin thinking about life beyond their current executive role? Those who might have spent the majority, perhaps the entirety of their working lives with you, where work isn't just what they do, it's really who they are. How do you protect the business, honour the legacy, design transitions that strengthen rather than fracture the relationships? Today, we're going to set out for you how our client Savills partnered with us to do exactly that. We'll introduce you to the structure of the Your Next Chapter programme, where deeply expert senior leaders were given real space to design long-term career plans that would take them into their third age and preserve the quality, loyalty, and warmth of the relationship with a much-loved employer. Put your feet up, grab a cup of tea while we explore what are the risks of not having a transition plan for those long-term expert members of your community. How might it be that identity, legacy, and contribution might start to shape late-stage career decisions? How to design a program that's high trust and confidential as it explores these key transitions? And what are the commercial and human impacts of helping senior leaders to leave well or to reshape their role with real intention? Let's get stuck in.
Welcome to The Career Equation, a practical formula for career conversations that helps businesses and their leaders to engage, retain, and grow their talent.
Hosted by Erica Sosner, Career Equation creator, and Zoe Schofield, careers expert and equation enthusiast.
Welcome, listeners. It's lovely to have you with us today. We're going to be sharing a case study from Savills today, looking at career conversations and career planning for senior leaders at the latter stages of their career. So in today's episode is really set around a case study, and it's about something that lots of organizations avoid until it's a little bit too late. And that's all about the twilight stages of senior careers. And this is a story of how Savills worked with us to help their long-serving senior directors design really thoughtful next chapters without damaging the business, the individual, or the relationship between them.
For those who haven't come across Savills before, Savills is a highly regarded global real estate advisory business with a long and exceptional heritage with great internal loyalty. Many of its senior directors have decades of tenure, fantastically deep and wide client relationships, significant internal influence, and careers that spent largely or entirely within the firm during an extraordinary growth trajectory. And in this organisation, as in many that are real passion project careers, work and identity were actually really deeply fused. There's an amazing sense of community there. And I think for many firms with that kind of loyalty and value, it creates a kind of quiet strategic risk. So we want to take you through the business problem that Savills told us they were facing, a little bit about why the traditional career navigation frameworks don't really work at this senior level, and how we designed the right program for them and what happened as a result. So, Savills came to us letting us know that they had this fantastic cadre of very high caliber, very much loved senior directors who were starting to think about how to plan and organize the later stages of their career. And Savills knew that they generally do a really exceptional job with kind of onboarding people at the start of their career, giving them the qualifications, the soft skills, the support, the network, and to really find their area of specialism and thrive. And they wanted to make sure that as people moved into transitions into retirement and into later stages of their career, that they were just as well cared for and curated and attended to as they had been at the very start.
So remember that for many people that they will have been perhaps working with you for the majority or even the entirety of their working lives. So their work isn't just what they do, it's who they are. And that's the kind of situation that Savills found themselves in, isn't it, Erica? It wasn't about poor performance or disengagement. These are, as you say, senior directors who are deeply loyal, highly capable, incredibly valuable to the business. But I guess there's a kind of quiet risk that was sitting underneath this about that longevity, but without a plan of what's next. Leaders were staying because they felt such a sense of responsibility that they didn't want to kind of let anybody down if they moved in, transitioned into something different. So perhaps feeling a bit stuck with multiple strategic roles and no structured way for them to divest themselves of those. So there was definitely some of the things that were coming to play there.
And in many cases, having an unclear succession or handover plan is a kind of critical dependency risk. A lot of the programs of work that Savills get engaged in are really long term. And I expect maybe for our listeners too, projects and programs of work over billions of pounds, over years of effort, and with lots of different phased activity. So how do we make sure when we're thinking about succession and transition that we're building a kind of landing path for that over a longer period of time of up to kind of 1 to 5 years? And particularly if someone is a critical dependency, how do we reduce that risk programmatically across the organization by starting to think about a variety of different people who might pick up the succession of one person's key activity at the moment? And then, of course, you've got the risk that, be it for, lifestyle reasons, health reasons, just change of direction reasons, that someone might leave suddenly without that well-thought succession plan being in place, and all of the things that would be lost in that case, or at least rushed. The knowledge transfer, the client transfer, the amazing expertise and kind of body of work that lives in the mind of someone who's been in an organization so long, and the client relationships that they've forged over a deeply expert working life. A client is not just, out of nowhere going to be happy to hand that over without a more gradual introduction and relationship building basis. So from the business side, there's a kind of real exposure and a kind of vulnerability around operational risk, both in terms of that kind of, brain drain, and things go badly. If you need to make a move that's enforced, then you've got that kind of bad lever risk as well. But you really, most people don't want knowledge walking out the door, especially people with such long-term relationships and care, who in Savills' case, and again, I'm sure for many of our listeners, have some pretty extraordinary alumni who've generated really fantastic quality referrals for many years to come. So how do we make sure that the very best of our community feel respected and appreciated and have that kind of confidential space to explore what's right for them? And in each of the cases, what is right for an individual is hugely different. So as we'll tell you a little bit more when it comes to impact, you needed to design a program that was fit for a range of individual purposes. I definitely want to be here for the next 10 years, but maybe take a couple of the more stressful hats off, to I want a succession plan for the next 1 to 3 years, to I know that I want to do something else and travel the world and spend more time with my children and grandchildren, that's fairly short horizon, to I would love to get out from under at some point, but I just cannot work out who's going to take these things off me, right? So everybody just had very, very different starting positions. So how do you create a program that's going to work for everybody, given that uniqueness?
Yeah, and what's important here is that Savills didn't come to us saying, we need to retain these people at all costs. What they came to us saying is, we need to handle this really well because they deserve that, and we want that for the business too. And that's a very different brief. Savills came to us with the concern that, many successful, long-established firms recognize that senior directors with long tenure who are deeply loyal, many of them never having worked anywhere else, their identity, their social world and their sense of purpose were completely entwined with the firm. So that sort of sense of responsibility to the business really ran deeply in them. So the career question here is not about what's your next role. It was much more about who are you when this role no longer is the central part of your life, if you like. So how can we work together to ensure that there's either a positive exit or a transition into something new on your terms and a kind of long-term beneficial alumni relationships? And I think that's where the angle we were coming from.
And so the design needed to include the opportunity to make thoughtful transitions, to have a chance to think for yourself, to talk to your peers, and then when you were ready to talk to the business about what you thought might be a win-win, and in a way that really preserved the relationships and celebrated the achievements of this incredibly strong and capable community.
And it's often where traditional frameworks, I suppose, can fall apart in this kind of dilemma, because promotional conversations don't apply to someone who's already at the top of their game. It's not the same sort of traditional what's the next step up for you or the next move into. So leaders weren't, as we said, asking what's my next role. They were asking, who am I if this role is no longer central to my life? How do I leave something that I helped to build without kind of feeling like I'm betraying it? And like, what would contribution look like for me next? So that kind of promotion-led career frameworks didn't apply, and nor did the sort of short-term, I guess, succession planning. We're talking here about career and life design, not just sort of role mapping in terms of succession planning in that sense.
Yeah, agreed. So the bespoke program design was all about just allowing participants the time and the space to reflect and plan over a year in a really considered and spacious way, wasn't it? It was about a variety of different things, from that succession piece, the knowledge transfer, the legacy within the organization, but also very much about like their personal development, their financial and sort of wider planning, their life goals, other things they might want to accomplish, and their career and life evolution. And so we had a variety of different frameworks to allow us to dip into that on a one-to-one, in a group, and across the wider group as well, didn't we, Zoe?
Yeah, and because we had the luxury of it spanning a year, that we could dip into those pieces again and again. So while, we might start at that beginning piece with a lovely dinner and everyone getting together and meeting each other, we then sort of launched very quickly into kind of one-to-one conversation with people around, okay, so where are we? Like, let's meet you where you are now, and getting that richer level of understanding about their journey so far in that kind of one-to-one conversation, what matters most to them. And then that kind of launched us back into group workshops again, so that we could do that collective learning together. And I think what's really lovely at that is you're really hearing the stories of others and seeing how, oh gosh, yeah, I get that. I feel a bit like that too. Because there's a sense of vulnerability in these conversations with senior managers that they don't often find easy to have with their teams, because they don't want that vulnerability to necessarily come out about, oh, what am I going to do in my life next? That's not necessarily where they feel comfortable, talking. So to have the opportunity to talk to colleagues about these vulnerabilities was really, really important. And so from sort of group workshops, we dive back into another one-to-one session. I think across the year, we had like 3 one-to-one sessions, I think, Erica, didn't we, with them? And then there was the group workshop elements as well. And what was really lovely towards the end of the program is we formed them into small groups, so they could have what we class as like an action learning session. So sort of small group coaching where they could keep the momentum of what they've started together and kind of keep them in action beyond the sort of formal program, to make sure that the things that they were designing to be their next chapter were going to come true. And so it really sort of took them from the beginning on a kind of real journey of discovery, I suppose.
Yeah. And what was one of the lovely things to see was the absolute kind of generosity and camaraderie and sort of peer accountability that worked really, really well. There was a lot of laughter in the rooms. There was a lot of like, sensitive and active listening, like generous thoughts and ideas to help people troubleshoot. So the program was very much about providing the frame to allow for self-discovery on the individual, on the paired, on the group level. And that sort of reciprocity of the people in the room being able to provide lots of answers and ideas and encouragement, way more really than the facilitators. And it was really wonderful to just see this flourishing of this senior director community through a journey of self-discovery, a kind of community of leaders who is so kind of self-sacrificing and kind of putting their teams first all the time, just giving them some protected time to really think about themselves. So we were very intentional about the sequence of that activity, from getting to know us on an individual basis, having the dinner, then, going to meet with one another, again, checking in about, so what have you now learned about yourself? And then when we returned to the group work, we were then starting to look at the future as a community together. And then the final closing coaching sessions would be about what the plan was out the back of that and how each colleague might start a conversation with their peers and their seniors in the business and HR to find the right way through and the right design for them. That's a bit of like the design of the program, but there were also like 3 core principles at the heart of that design. And Zoe, kick us off with the first.
Yeah, I mean, the first principle is about building trust and engagement first. Before any group work, we began with a really confidential one-to-one conversation that sort of invited them into the discussion about the program. You know, what we have to bear in mind at a senior level, engagement isn't automatic. You know, these are highly experienced, highly intelligent people that don't always open up easily, and nor should they, you know. So we wanted to create a real psychologically safe environment that allowed them to be really honest. And there were a few sort of like weren't really sure at the beginning of the program. What's this all about? You know, is it they're trying to get rid of me or hoist me out of the building? And they soon realized in those one-to-one conversations, absolutely not. That is not what the intention of the program was. It was very much about, as we've just described, creating this wonderful learning journey and experience for them as a valued person in the organization. So those initial coaching space did allow them to reflect honestly on where they were, to really speak about those unspoken anxieties and clarify what they wanted from the program, and to sort of begin separating out themselves from their title. And I think that was really important, that we saw them as an individual, not just a director, you know, a senior manager within the organization. And we knew then that that trust would drive candor from them. And then the candor would help them to drive personal insights that would ultimately lead them to good decisions about what they wanted to do next or where their path might take them. And I think without that foundation, then everything else would have been a bit sort of, I guess, performative in terms of a program if we didn't get them fully, and I mean fully, on board with why they would want to engage with this well and to be honest in that engagement.
Mm. And of course, that trust building became easier as the cohorts went along. Like the pilot was run with the C-suite who had commissioned it. So they were, you know, more amenable to seeing how it might be designed and very influential in helping us to reshape it. But I think once we went out to market, as you were, internally, I think the first one, there was quite a lot of like sort of anxiety and suspicion. But then, of course, as that cohort completed and really started to celebrate what wonderful experience they'd had and how useful it was for them, and became advocates and sponsors for the program, and even came back to support us in a co-facilitating role as we moved forward, which was amazing. Then that cynicism eased, right? Because other people really trusted said, hey, this was great. And that really, really helped us. And, you know, my work is really informed by this idea of biographical narrative and the appreciation of individual stories. And that those stories have their touch points, both, you know, the highs and the painful bits. You know, life and work is sometimes incredibly exhilarating. Sometimes it's absolutely dreadful and can only be endured. And sometimes it's a bit, you know, mundane and in the middle. And having a chance to just think about all of those moments and honor that past, and then use that to expand into the future with creativity is really, really useful. So our first workshop was really focusing in on properly acknowledging what is it that you've built, the contributions that you've made, your legacy, your patterns of energy across your career, and getting a sense of the value of that for an individual, for the business, for the clients in terms of your contribution. Because you can't really design a future chapter until you've had a chance to unravel and make sense of, and even put to bed, you know, some of the different decisions or more challenging times. And so once we'd had a chance to take stock of history, then we started to shift towards what's the future design. And the future design work was often about using the career equation as a framework to look at your contribution, your values, your lifestyle, not just the role that you're in or the roles you might move into, but where work sits in your wider life. And that was, you know, it was a huge range of people who were about to jump into new entrepreneurial ventures. People were really looking forward to having more time to play and to enjoy their leisure. People who wanted to study, people who wanted to give back, people who wanted to stay in the business longer term. That huge variety of things. And so we needed to shift into kind of visioning and imagination work, and to be really, really conscientious about providing a space for senior people to do that, because highly experienced leaders are generally exceptionally good at their operational thinking, their strategic execution, the managing of risk, but they may not have exercised the opportunity for creative imagination with themselves at the center of that for years, you know, and particularly when you've been in one organization on a terrific journey, you haven't had to find too much of that creative realm about what to do next, because the business kind of took you along with it. It was kind of growing and evolving all through that time. So it felt really important that recognizing that all the research in adult development and neuroscience tells us that as we get older, and particularly in high responsibility roles, we tend to rely more on our analytical and convergent thinking, optimizing things, managing risk, narrowing the options. But what we were asking them to do was to do divergent thinking, opening up the sense of creativity and possibility, and to imagine multiple possible futures and options. And that can reduce down over time, over your lifetime, if it isn't intentionally exercised. So in terms of the design, we had a lot of these kind of creative future narrative visualizations, explorations, articulations of possibility, not as a gimmicky kind of self-help piece, but really as a practical tool to reactivate imaginative thinking, because they were making significant shifts in their sense of self and identity. And using the imagination, I found, using the imagination and therefore story of the future actually lowers people's fear, because it helps them see that there are a wide range of options that could be fantastic. And of course, the opportunity to be creative also just reconnects people to their intrinsic motivations, to curiosity, to contribution, and to fun. When we did the sort of collage work, it was wonderful to see just how much joy was in the room, and how the kind of childlike delight of just doing something playful with scissors and glue is like still really good for everybody and really valuable. It was actually very moving when we did our kind of gallery walks and people talked to us about what was important to them and why they'd chosen things that might have seemed like a bit of a frippery, but actually had a real potency about saying what was important to them, and how might they also expand their cognition to that creativity and innovation place, so that they can apply the skills of strategic thinking and execution and risk management to their own lives and to their own dreams.
And I kind of had that memory then, Erica, of people actually did take them vision boards away with them and present them to their partners, their wives, their husbands, and say, look what I've done today. It was quite funny. I remember a conversation with one of my one-to-one clients in that, explaining that. Yes. I took it home, I showed my wife, and then she's done her own. And I just think it just created this energy that was, often you say, I went on a course today. What did you do? Oh, bit of this and that. But they actually were able to visually show them something about, this is what I see for the future. So it was really moving and really energizing for everybody.
Absolutely.
And then I think from the kind of, once you've got into that land of where you're looking and generating that kind of vision for the future, then we moved in that kind of second workshop much more into from vision to architecture. So this was then about, okay, so how do we get there? What are the clear goals you want to set around moving towards that vision board? What are the roadmaps that you're going to need to take to get us there? There was some really nice healthy peer challenge around some of that, because we start to bring in some of those sort of limiting beliefs can come into play, or those sort of challenges. So there was some healthy dialogue around that as well. So we did a bit of, sort of worst case scenario planning. So they loved the risk management stuff. So that was an easy one to play into the mix. And as I said earlier, we brought in success circles, which was this sort of small coaching circles where they could keep that momentum of work with each other going beyond just the formal work of the program. And, the worst case scenario piece was really powerful, because when you begin to articulate those fears, whether that's financial or reputational, relationships, it can then shrink it into something a bit more manageable. And we were dipping into areas which they weren't kind of covering in their day-to-day work necessarily, when we were looking at the whole of themselves in terms of what they wanted for the future. And yeah, the small circles, success circles, were those action learning groups. And that was about momentum for sure.
Yeah, there's something about how deep change and transformation doesn't just happen from being inspired. It also happens from being accountable for taking action. And there's a kind of, in these big personal transformation programs, it's really important to balance the two. Like, people need the space to be creative, to reimagine, to have light touch, to play. And then there's a kind of need to ground that into, so what does that mean for me? What's next for me? What's next for us as a business? And how do I keep my kind of rhythm and cadence and commitments to myself and to others as that change continues to flow? And one of the models that we use for that is the idea of the hero's journey. Again, a narrative framework for transformation. and sort of mapping that on the floor for our participants to track, where am I now in relation to this journey of transformation, and what's next? What's the next step and stage? Because again, I always believe that the more that people have kind of visual and kinesthetic, sort of felt clarity about what's happening next, the easier it is to go and do it, even if that takes some courage or it's an unfamiliar realm for them. And, to help along the way with that, the one-to-one coaching was essential. It was kind of peppered throughout the year-long program. It was entirely confidential. Nothing got fed back to the business. And that was really critical because people were sharing all kinds of things, cathartic things, tricky things, personal and health and family and financial things that couldn't be separated from how they defined success or what they wanted out of their work. So whilst the group energy creates that ideas and the momentum, the private space allows that safe space for decision making, for reflection, for catharsis. And that flow of the two and the balance of that really made, I think, a big difference between having private space for reflection, then sharing as a group and being generous and exchanging ideas, the chance to imagine a future and to articulate that to others, and then perhaps a bit more quiet space to do the strategic planning and the kind of troubleshooting around that, and to have the accountability and the support and the cheerleading of your peers. So I feel particularly proud of this program because I feel that we managed to find the balance between honouring the identity of the individual, their professional legacy and huge credibility, and the commercial realities for the business, like all at once, and in nearly every case managed to get a real win-win.
And I think what I love so much, Erica, is that the outcomes were so different and so varied. There was no single right answer. Some people might have moved into new things fairly quickly. Some had a longer term sort of transition and succession plan. Some were looking at entrepreneurial futures, some very different types of roles and different types of opportunities. It was not the same for everybody. And that's what's so lovely. And I think what it also did for a lot of people was help them to refocus on kind of some joyful bits of their life and the things that they've missed or not had time for, that they would like to bring back in going forward, and those client relationships that really meant a lot to them, and which ones they wanted to stay closer to for the time being, which ones actually it was time and ready to hand over to somebody else within the organization with care and mentorship around how to do that. So, these are kind of complex roles in organizations that did take handling with care, I think, in terms of those discussions that we had.
Yeah, and that is clean and positive, whether some people did go, I know what I want to do, and it's a long-held personal or entrepreneurial or educational ambition, and it was done with kind of joyful celebration and support on both sides, and in a fairly speedy timeline, just because that's the timeline that they had. Other people designed kind of I'd say this was the average, like a 2 to 5 year handover strategy, because also you want to bring up that sort of junior senior talent, as it were, underneath them. So often with that set of successors built out over time for the long term, with all the different niches and strands of all the opportunities that exist within Savills. They do a huge range of things around real estate, and that the individuals continue, leading their relevant division, staying long enough to really transfer knowledge properly, and to have those achievements sort of celebrated and acknowledged. The goal wasn't how do we help everybody to exit? It was about how do we embrace each individual and what was right for each person, with partnership and care from the organisation as they navigate those. There is no fixed retirement age. Everybody has a different sense of what the third age is going to look and feel like for them. And, we had some really lovely success stories, and we continue to get some really great feedback, people staying in touch with us and telling us what they did next. There is an episode of The Equation, we'll pop it in the show notes, the podcast, where we speak to Dominic Grace, and he was the ex-head of London Residential at Savills, and he is a Your Next Chapter graduate. And you can listen to him talking about his new era on the podcast. And he really articulated that if you want an elegant process for onboarding people within an organisation, then you also want an elegant way of offboarding and supporting them, and to have a supportive, he said, an excellent supportive initiative that really gave me the confidence to know what it was that I could do and make a success of it, which he has. He's been fantastically successful. Another of the director level grads told me I came to this program thinking it was all about the company wanting me to retire. And I realized pretty quickly that I was completely wrong. It's interesting how like the most talented people in an organization always think that they're for the job, and then those are completely oblivious. So I'm really shocked when they are like, it's just, this program was not about that. And the one-to-one support throughout the coaching combined with the group workshops meant that I felt able to carve out and determine for myself how I want the next chapter in my life to look like. The program created an environment to actively articulate for myself the thoughts and the ideas that I'd never considered before. And although I don't plan on retiring anytime soon, I certainly know how I'm going to approach it when I do. And I don't plan on doing just gardening. How about you, Zoe? You had lots of lovely one-to-one encounters as well. What kind of feedback did you get about the program?
Yeah, we absolutely did. And one comes to mind is Tim Burley, who was one of my one-to-ones, but was part of one of the programs, who's formerly a director in strategic FM advisor in Savills. And what Tim said is that for him, the next chapter program was completely eye-opening. It was structured and logical with lots of practical ways to determine what he wanted from the future, what he wanted it to look like. And that he didn't shy away from difficult conversations. And whenever he got a bit stuck, that's what he would thrush out with his personal coach and in one-to-one coaching. And so for him, it became a real game changer. So that was, and that's why we do it. That's ultimately what we're looking for from the program, is a safe space to really explore what might be next. I think one of the things that also I remember from lots of the conversations, Erica, and I think you probably had this too, is that what we were teaching them, if you like, and introducing them to this idea of self-reflection and clarity and the equation threaded through, was that they then went away and had those kinds of conversations with people in their team as part of those sort of succession conversations, and not making assumptions about who was the right person and do they actually want it. And I can remember one of the people that I was coaching was like, oh my gosh, I went away. I'd made so many assumptions about who I thought wanted to step into whose shoes and what it looked like. And actually, when I got into kind of utilizing the equation and how we'd done it with them, and those conversations made a vast difference to those plans. And people really felt on board and engaged and very supportive then of the decisions that he was making about what he wanted to do next. They completely saw where he was coming from. So that was really wonderful. I think that it wasn't just learning for those and the cohorts. It was what they then took back into the business and that kind of shared experience, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of business impact from a human point of view, people felt quite a bit of relief. That kind of guilt around maybe they'd already been thinking about wanting to change. The guilt started to lift a little bit. And for those that had not yet thought about life beyond Savills or even began to imagine it, it did become possible for them to get excited about the future and their next steps, what the new business might be. They're sailing around the world, more golf, more wine, more cheese, or whatever it might have been, pottering in the garden, traveling. They actually started, we could see that energy shift. And they didn't feel guilty about wanting to think about those things. That there was a sort of like level of personal permission as well as organizational permission to have that thought, to think about what they would do, from an intellectual point of view beyond the program, whether it was consulting or NED roles or volunteering. It really opened up those conversations.
Yeah, I feel like I've been coaching now over 20 years. And some of the one-to-one work I did with Savills is like some of my most memorable and some of the work that I feel most fondly towards and most proud of, because in terms of just the kind of caliber and generosity of spirit and like humor of Savills people, very lucky to have such exceptional people who are so generous and high integrity and hardworking and want so much to do and be their best in everything that they do. But I think also just really recognizing that the more senior you get, the lonelier it can get and the harder it can be to say, that this is tough. And it's rarely tough because it's like the work itself. It's tough because of this sort of allowing yourself permission to consider things on your own behalf, And there were a couple of times where I knew that someone was telling me something about a way that had shaped who they were and how they were that was really limiting for them, that didn't seem to be true to me, but that it was really important for them to say it to someone out loud and to just create the space where they could transform their perspective and see that lightness come in was just incredible and very, very moving and exciting. So yeah, some of my favorite coaching moments, and it's been wonderful to hear all the amazing things they've got up to. And from a business perspective, of course, for for the organization, there were numerous ROIs. The exits became much, much better planned on both sides rather than abrupt or confusing or obtuse, and reorgs at strategic level and shifts were much more kind of better managed because you had much better insight about what the senior leaders wanted out of their careers. The knowledge gain, the knowledge stayed within the system much, much longer. And there were, much more structured ways of getting people to articulate their expertise or perspective or ideas. And one of my clients set up a podcast internally, for example, of just sharing best practice in a way that was really generous and just better organized. And in any organization, complex exits always require a lot of thought, a lot of care, a lot of long-term planning. So having a much more intentional and well-informed succession strategy that was well mapped out was much, much better for business continuity, much more sort of a safe pair of hands around the client relationships being thoughtfully shared and handed over, the chance to do really good quality education and side-by-side development for successors that was sort of thoughtfully structured over the medium to long term. And having honest upfront conversations about things like compensation, or if you needed to renegotiate a contract, or greater level of flexibility, or going part-time, that both sides came to the table ready to see how they might make that work. And crucially, leaving didn't mean remotely losing the relationships. It just meant evolving it to continue to be a rich win-win all round, and really testimony again to the kind of caliber of people and the quality of friendship that had obviously developed over the years, because alumni produce a huge value chain of referrals for the organization and introduction. So it was wonderful to see that continue.
Yeah, and I think, we have to remember that if we don't help senior people to leave well or transition out into new roles, then there's the potential that they'll leave badly and kind of painfully for them and for you, or they may stay stuck for longer, and that's not healthy for everyone either. And so it's really important that you get that right. I think as we think about bringing this episode to a close, that some invitational things to think about is that when it comes to your long-serving talent and very valuable talent, that you still treat that kind of latter stage career as a sort of design challenge, that we don't make assumptions that they know exactly what they want to do next or how they want to transition into something different, that we give them the opportunity, like we would for early entrants, when we think about apprenticeship schemes and grad schemes and stuff, that it's just as important, these conversations in the latter stage of career. We shouldn't assume that they have all the answers or that they're talking to someone else about it, because they may not be. These are very, very busy people. So to invest in that kind of planned transition, and rather than those sort of emergency exits, if you like, and to recognize that alumni, are a hugely strategic asset for the business. And so if we don't handle that, the sort of twilight career well, then you lose that asset and that valuable relationship. And this work was not about, as we said right back at the beginning, it was not about retention at all costs at all. It was about the right transitions for the individual and for the organization as well.
Yeah, a wonderful piece of work. We'd love to keep doing more of this work. And perhaps in your organization, this would be something to think about. So, remember, how you help people leave just tells everybody else what it's like to stay and why to stay. And careers don't end when people leave, of course, they change shape. And how that is managed and handled says a huge amount about the caliber of the business that you're working in and whether you'll recommend it as a future employer to others. So if you found this exciting and you would like to explore how to embed a really great transitional career program at any age or stage within your organization, you can book a conversation with Zoe and I at thecareerequation.com. And it will just be 30 minutes of us finding out about who you're working with and what you're worried about and what kind of career ages and stages and transitions and transformations you think might be important. And we will do our best to throw our best thinking at it and add value to you. So it costs nothing but your time. And there's a link in the show notes. We hope that you'll enjoy checking out our Q&A episode later this week. It comes out on a Thursday. And do check in for some of our good conversation, bad conversations, where we get under the skin of a guest's career conversation and how career strategies and philosophies are managed in their business.
Bye for now.